Hi, welcome. I'm Gustav, and this is a mind-body approach to protracted withdrawal syndrome. When I was in withdrawal, I always thought time was of the essence, so let's get right to it. In this video, I'll share with you the way I resolved withdrawal syndrome for myself and how maybe you can too. To do that, I'm going to present 5 chapters. Let's take a brief look at them now. Chapter 1. What is protracted withdrawal syndrome? Here, I'll first talk about acute withdrawal, then I'll propose a physiological theory on how withdrawal may become protracted over time. Chapter 2. What is the mind-body syndrome, or TMS? This will go deeper than the first chapter, where I'll introduce the mind-body connection, then propose a psychological theory as the ultimate cause for withdrawal syndrome. I'll note this theory is non-pathologizing, meaning it's not about disease or anything being wrong with you. In Chapter 3, a personal illustration of TMS, I'll discuss some of my own withdrawal experiences that help me to understand them as mind-body phenomena and formulate some of the ideas in this video. Moving now to Chapter 4, it's called a TMS approach for protracted withdrawal. This is the more action-oriented chapter, where I'll take the educational foundation from the previous chapters to suggest practical ways to resolve withdrawal syndrome. And finally, in Chapter 5, we'll look at potential barriers of a TMS approach. I'll address some specific concerns that may arise when considering using or actually using a mind-body approach for withdrawal. Now, each of these chapters we just looked at will build upon each other to reveal a mind-body understanding and approach to any stage of psychiatric drug withdrawal. I will, however, place an emphasis on protracted withdrawal syndrome in this video. Also, as we go through each chapter, I'll provide academic references or other types of references when relevant. You can access this reference list and additional information that expands upon this presentation through a resource link in the description below. Now, before we proceed with the first chapter, I need to place a disclaimer here so it's clear that I'm basically a guy on the internet sharing information. Ultimately, it's up to you, I hope, to make your own life choices, even though that may seem impossibly difficult at times like these. Here's that disclaimer. I am not a licensed medical professional, and the content of this video does not constitute medical advice. Everything included herein is presented from my own personal perspective and for informational purposes only. I share the following content with some reluctance, as it may contain errors. However, I think those exposed to psychiatric drugs deserve to know of every possibility for healing from them. Please note the specific approach for protracted withdrawal outlined in this video is meant to be complementary to other harm reduction strategies for psychiatric drug withdrawal. Finally, any cinema and video references included herein may be altered so that their original meaning is changed. With that in mind, if you wish to join me, then come and let's get started.
Ihr Kleines. Hier ist ein Valium. Dann kannst du vielleicht ein wenig schlafen.
Es geht mir schon besser. Ich bin dir so dankbar, Kurt.
The first time I experienced psychiatric drug withdrawal, I had no idea what was going on. Like most people taking these drugs, I was never provided with informed consent. I was never told, for instance, that I could become physically dependent on psychiatric drugs. In light of this common malpractice, before we start talking about protracted withdrawal, I'd like to first present some background information on how psychiatric drugs may induce physical dependency and why, when we stop taking them, a withdrawal reaction might occur. Psychiatric drugs are psychoactive substances that change the normal state of the brain in ways that are not fully understood. What is known is that psychiatric drugs are neurodisturbers. By this, I mean they cause neurological dysfunction, including biochemical imbalances that disturb the basic operation of the nervous system. Now, because psychiatric drugs do throw the brain off balance, defense mechanisms are activated in an attempt to return the brain to equilibrium. What ensues is a sort of tug-of-war between the drug and the brain's defenses. Now, this is a simplification, but the point is that a psychiatric drug has a certain mechanism of action, and the brain's defenses oppose that action. Ultimately, the brain may learn to rebalance itself alongside the drug, and you learn or try to learn to live under its intoxicating effects.
Das bin also ich.
Now, for so many of us, being on psychiatric drugs is an unpleasant experience, and coming off them may be even worse. To suggest why this might be, I'd like to expand on that tug-of-war metaphor. Imagine for a moment that this is a nervous system. Absurd, I know, but like this rubber band, the nervous system has plasticity, meaning it's adaptable. When you take a psychiatric drug, tension is placed on the nervous system, right? It's out of balance now. So the brain adapts itself to oppose the drug's action, and hopefully a more balanced tension forms. You may still get adverse effects, but the brain tries its best to compensate. Now, if you stop taking a psychiatric drug too quickly, the tension breaks. Not the nervous system, it's still here. But what's created is a temporarily imbalanced neurological state that you may feel as acute withdrawal. That is, until it returns to its natural balance. This crude illustration represents perhaps the leading theory of psychiatric drug dependency, called the oppositional model of tolerance.
Ich werde wahnsinnig. Ich werde verrückt.
A common question we all probably ask is, when will withdrawal end? Well, estimates for the duration of acute withdrawal vary, usually between 1 to 8 weeks. Acute withdrawal could last longer than that. It's just difficult to measure. In any case, acute withdrawal will end. The brain will return to its natural balance, and we heal. The problem, though, is that for some of us, the end of acute withdrawal is only the beginning of a longer nightmare where withdrawal experiences keep going. This we could call protracted withdrawal syndrome, which is kind of odd. How could withdrawal continue even after we've healed? Well, in an attempt to begin answering this question, I'd like to suggest a physiological theory. But for that, I'll need to begin by giving some relevant background information on the brain. Please keep in mind here that I'm not a professional researcher, and I'm simplifying complex processes to the best of my knowledge. I'll start by saying that the brain, as part of the central nervous system, follows the principle of neuroplasticity, meaning it can rewire itself in ways that changes how it functions. Part of this rewiring process is accomplished by neural pathways, which are made up of thousands of brain cells connecting and disconnecting over time. Now, these pathways are organized for specific purposes, such as to help us learn new behaviors, habits, and activities. As I just suggested there, the way neural pathways form is through learning. This means you can intentionally rewire your brain by learning a new skill. When you learn to ride a bike, for example, neural pathways form that enable the coordination of this activity. Then through your practice, these pathways are reinforced and stored in memory. Your brain then learns to ride a bike so well, you don't even have to think about it anymore. Now, the ability of our brain to learn is of course beneficial, but there is a potential downside to neuroplasticity, because it's possible for us to learn something we didn't mean to learn. For instance, it's now known that people can learn to be in chronic pain. Say, for example, you injure yourself, maybe your arm. Well, what happens is a danger signal is sent up to the brain. Neural pathways then form to process the experience of pain. What should hurt, how much, so on. But the thing is, even after the injury heals, these neural pathways generating pain can remain behind. So despite physically healing, it's still possible to experience pain. This is sometimes called neuroplastic pain because it comes from learned changes in the brain. Now, the reason I'm talking about neuroplasticity and pain is because what I propose is that protracted withdrawal is something that is learned, sort of like neuroplastic pain. All this means is that neural pathways that generate withdrawal can be learned and remembered, so the experience of withdrawal continues even after we've healed. But how does this work? I mean, how do we actually learn withdrawal? Well, to suggest how this might happen, I'll now take the known understanding of neuroplastic pain and adapt it to the withdrawal situation. Let's take a look. The possibility of learning withdrawal may begin with the withdrawal reaction. In acute withdrawal, like with an injury, a danger signal is activated. Withdrawal neural pathways then form to help us process the withdrawal reaction, what we should feel, and how we should experience it. One way our brain tells us to experience withdrawal is to feel fear, especially fear of withdrawal sensations. Now, because our brain instructs us to feel fear, we naturally start paying closer attention to withdrawal. What's this feeling? Is it worse than yesterday? Why is this happening to me? This can quickly progress to, oh my God, is my nervous system damaged? Is my life doomed? Withdrawal can take over our entire existence. And if what's true for learning neuroplastic pain is true for withdrawal, then our fear and negative emotions are directly involved in the brain's processing of withdrawal itself. What this means is that our preoccupation with withdrawal and our belief that we're damaged fuels the neural pathways generating our withdrawal experience. Our obsessing encourages these pathways to fire again and again. Eventually, the brain learns to use these pathways so well that withdrawal sensations can continue even after we've healed. Most simply stated, one of the most astonishing discoveries in neuroscientific research is that we can think ourselves sick. To put this another way, protracted withdrawal is learned and maintained by a fear cycle. First, a danger signal is activated when the drug is reduced or removed. Second, this leads to the formation of neural pathways that process and generate our withdrawal experience. Third, our response to withdrawal is fear and preoccupation, but this only makes us expect withdrawal to continue and thus a dire future. Unfortunately, this only reinforces the original danger signal, and it's our continued sense we're in danger that now drives the withdrawal experience. The result of this fear cycle or feedback loop is that withdrawal pathways are normalized in the brain, where they can simulate withdrawal sensations even after the initial reaction is over. What this means is that what we call protracted withdrawal is not technically withdrawal. It's more like withdrawal memories that the brain has learned to play back over and over again. But you won't necessarily experience them all the time. Withdrawal pathways, like pain pathways, are stored in memory, and they can turn on or off depending on both our sense of danger and our conditioning. That is, when we expect withdrawal to happen, it probably will. Now, to be clear, this is not a disease. We do not have a neural pathway problem. Protracted withdrawal is something we unconsciously learned. It's not your fault. It's now possible, however, to get intentionally involved and unlearn withdrawal. Now, this whole idea might sound strange to you, but just recently, 2 randomized controlled trials have shown this understanding of neuroplastic pain as a starting point to its resolution.
Changes in the brain cause the pain to persist. Basically, the brain learns the pain. And what we tried to do in this study was teach people how to unlearn the pain.
And this unlearning was accomplished through a mind-body education that in these studies made it likely for people to intentionally resolve chronic pain, once thought and often still thought to be impossible. Now, for us, the first step in this education is to realize that even though we might be experiencing the most horrific suffering of our lives. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with us. We're not damaged. Heck, we're not even really in withdrawal anymore. Now, I should point out that this mind-body approach for protracted withdrawal remains anecdotal, but there are people reporting success, and that of course includes myself, and I'll get to my own experiences later. For now though, we still need to know more. I mean, how do we unlearn withdrawal sensations? You can't only say to stop fearing withdrawal. That's absurd. So we have to look deeper. If we want to resolve withdrawal syndrome, we have to know why it's happening. We have to understand its purpose. Pain and fear are part of an ancient neurological system meant to protect us by signaling a warning of potential danger. And yet the perceived danger or even terror we feel seems so purposeless. I remember repeatedly crying out, help me, to no one in particular. But the human mind is intelligent. It doesn't generate experiences of danger for no reason. So what I'd suggest is that the brain is in fact trying to protect us. It's just not from something we're consciously aware of. We've discussed the role of fear driving withdrawal, right? Well, as we begin to shift gears here, we'll see that our felt fear is just the tip of the iceberg of deeper emotions, much outside our conscious awareness. If that sounds confusing, that's to be expected, as this marks the segue into the next chapter. If you join me, we'll continue on deeper, and I'll present a psychological theory, the mind-body syndrome, that I propose is the ultimate cause of protracted withdrawal.
Also ich kann Sie da ganz und gar beruhigen, Frau Staude. Organisch ist alles in Ordnung. Bisschen blutarm sind Sie.
Wissen Sie,
Ja.
ich habe in letzter Zeit oft so Angstgefühle, ganz seltsam.
Aber jeweils nur eine, nicht mehr. Aber da kann ich mich sicher ganz auf Sie verlassen. Also, Wiedersehen und machen Sie sich keine Gedanken.
Like Margot here, when I suggested to a psychiatrist that I was suffering adverse effects from coming off psychiatric drugs, he just insisted I had a psychiatric disorder. But the truth is, psychiatric disorders aren't demonstrated to exist. The American Psychiatric Association even admits that. So while I was tortured by terrifying sensations, nothing was actually found medically wrong with me. This was incredibly frustrating, and sadly, dealing with clueless medical professionals is all too common. Despite us living in an age of major medical and technological advances, it's estimated that more than 40% of people at a primary doctor's appointment are experiencing medically unexplainable phenomena. This includes syndromes with no identifiable cause, such as much back pain and skin problems, migraines, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, IBS, insomnia, and yes, protracted withdrawal. But why has so much human suffering remained medically unexplainable? Well, as I proposed in the first chapter, sometimes what seems like a medical problem is actually a neuroplastic one, that is, a learned experience by the brain. Most doctors coming from pharma-sponsored education aren't trained to consider this possibility, certainly not for withdrawal. So as we carry on here to investigate why we learn withdrawal, its purpose, we must continue to go beyond the medical model. To do that, we'll need to see ourselves not as patients, but as human beings, and how our responses to life have affected our learning brain. This is where the mind-body connection comes in. The idea here is that the mind is intimately connected to the physiology of the body. And this connection, including here when it's troublesome, is primarily accomplished through emotions. We actually began talking about this last chapter when I suggested that withdrawal is learned through an emotionally driven fear cycle, right? But I also hinted that beneath our fear is deeper emotions we're not feeling. That's because, like much brain activity, our emotions can be unconscious. And it's the emotions we don't necessarily feel that can play the leading role in learning withdrawal. Now, this might sound baffling and implausible. I certainly thought that myself. And after psychiatry, I didn't want anyone talking to me about my emotions. But if you bear with me, I'd like to share a little neuroscientific research that shows the relationship between unconscious emotions and learned pain syndromes. I note here that since protracted withdrawal is also a learned syndrome, I'm really talking about that here as well. It's not exactly like this, but this is a useful illustration.
Fermo, non respiri, fermo.
The fMRI images you're looking at now document the brain's learning process as it transitions from acute pain to chronic pain. The study began by scanning the brains of participants who recently suffered a physical injury. That's represented visually here in Visit 1. The colored areas show brain activity generally associated with acute pain. Now, for those participants whose pain continued even after they healed, their brains were scanned again, seen here in Visit 2, Visit 3, and Visit 4. Notice that the active areas of the brain, the colored areas, are shifting. The brain is rewiring itself to prolong the experience of pain. The areas associated with acute injury are turning off. And what's turning on are brain regions related to memory and emotional processing. Just compare Visit 1 for acute pain to Visit 4 for chronic pain. The difference is night and day. And yet, participants in this study were unaware that their brains were filling with emotions as their pain became chronic. Their main experience remained physical discomfort. Now, how is this study relevant to us? Well, if we substitute learned withdrawal for learned pain, then I interpret this study as suggesting that what drives the learning of withdrawal is an ongoing emotional process taking place outside our awareness. What this means is that our conscious fear, what we feel, is not a sufficient explanation for learning withdrawal. There must be something deeper going on as well.
Was ist das? Was ist das Ich?
So, what are these emotions we're not aware of? Well, considering we feel fear, these emotions must be perceived by the brain as potentially dangerous. In fact, those of us who learn neuroplastic syndromes, like withdrawal, tend to have experienced life events we've found deeply unsettling. These events I'm talking about now go outside of withdrawal itself and are at the core of our life experiences, both past and present. And it's these deeper emotions that are now stirring. This is a very important idea that I'll return to shortly. But first, let's take a moment to recap. Last chapter, we saw it's our memory that stores neural pathways of our previous withdrawal experiences. And the brain can remember them, so we feel withdrawal again. We also saw that the way these pathways are remembered is by a danger signal. And I emphasized our conscious fear and preoccupation with withdrawal in maintaining that signal. But now we're seeing that this danger signal is setting off more than just our fear of withdrawal, but reminding the brain about deeper emotional processing, about life experiences when we also felt in danger or upset. And it's these unconscious emotions that are now feeding into our fear and causing withdrawal sensations to persist. And yet, our attention mostly remains on the withdrawal experience itself. We're not aware of its emotional basis. Now, this is so strange. I mean, why do we learn withdrawal sensations instead of just feeling all our deepest emotions directly? Well, this takes us toward the purpose of learning withdrawal and into the mind-body syndrome.
Ich werde wahnsinnig.
Before I can define mind-body syndrome, I need to take another moment here to address this deeper emotional processing our brains are perceiving as dangerous. To do that, I'd like to discuss 3 sources of threatening emotions, and then show how it's possible we might not be fully aware of them. Finally, I can then get into how these hidden emotions get activated to cause all sorts of problems, like protracted withdrawal. To begin then, the first source of threatening emotions comes from childhood pressures. These are difficult experiences from earlier in life, and often include a sense of feeling unloved or abandoned in some way. What this leads to are feelings of unsafety, and fear is first planted in us. Take, for example, young Margot. She was neglected by her parents in childhood, and when her father left the family, she felt unloved. Difficult childhood experiences generate long-lasting emotions that can carry over into adulthood and lead us to interpret the world, including our own mind and bodies, as a dangerous place. Now, this leads me to the second source of threatening emotions, very much influenced by our past, and that's internal pressures. Here, I'm talking about personality traits like perfectionism and goodism, which is the self-defeating need to be good. Now, I say these traits are influenced by our past because they may develop to protect us, like from upsetting other people and feeling unsafe again, like maybe we did in childhood.
Dein Urgroßvater hätte die Schlacht von Katowice gewinnen müssen.
But there's a potential problem here, because if we're too hard on ourselves, our perfectionism can generate emotions like guilt as we strive to be an impossibly perfect person. The brain may then perceive our internal pressure as dangerous if we're not living up to our own personal or some external standard. Now, the third and final source of threatening emotions I wish to mention here is influenced and intensified by both childhood and internal pressures, and that's adult pressures. This includes challenges in human relationships or forms of oppression, whether economically, socially, psychiatrically, what have you. These can lead to a range of powerful emotions in their own right and trigger related emotions from the past. Take Margot again. Like her father, her husband threatens to leave.
Erst bemühen wir uns wochenlang, einen Platz zu bekommen und dann... Wir machen uns ja lächerlich.
And yet Margot, who learned to put pressure on herself in childhood, blames herself for her domestic unhappiness.
Was ist das Ich?
Now that we've looked at these three sources of threatening emotions, let's consider how they might become unconscious and their role in learning withdrawal. So each of the pressures listed here, from childhood or personality or adulthood, can generate emotions that the brain interprets as perhaps too painful for us to consciously feel. Whether it's fear and sadness from childhood, or guilt and inferiority we've internalized, or our current rage against injustices committed against us. In any case, when these powerful emotions are generated, they may be perceived by the brain as dangerous. For this reason, the brain has a defense mechanism called repression. Repression shifts as much as possible undesirable emotions into unconscious aspects of the mind. This attempts to protect us from overwhelming emotions or things we just don't want to be aware of. Earlier, I spoke about unconscious emotional processing that gets activated and drives the learning of pain, and as I suggested, withdrawal too, right? Well, this processing involves at least some of these repressed emotions that have now turned on in withdrawal. Now, the reason these emotions have turned on is because of the psychological stress of our situation. In fact, it's not uncommon for those of us who develop protracted withdrawal to be in stressful circumstances even before withdrawal begins. Then withdrawal hits, And oh my God, it's terrifying, isn't it? Then we read horror stories, lack support, get angry with psychiatry, or even blame ourselves. The point is that we're really in an emotionally charged situation. And if our current stress reminds the brain about when we previously felt helpless, victimized, abandoned, then repressed emotions related to these incidents can be triggered. When this happens, activated emotions from both our past and present threaten to surface into the conscious mind, where we could become aware of them. But these emotions are too devastating for us to fully feel. Therefore, our brain intervenes to protect us. Now, as to how this happens, I'll put it this way. We all avoid thinking about things, right? We say, I don't want to think about that. Well, there are also things we don't want to feel. And when repressed emotions threaten to enter our awareness, the brain has a backup system to protect us. And that's simply to shift our attention elsewhere. That could go from browsing on our phones to using alcohol or drugs to numb our feelings. And maybe this does distract us for a while with pleasurable sensations. But what's also possible is that painful sensations can distract us from our emotions. The brain may especially use this strategy following an injury or perceived injury, such as acute withdrawal. This is because the brain sees the withdrawal reaction as an opportunity to divert our attention from something stressful going on in our lives. In fact, we can get so preoccupied and scared of withdrawal sensations that a fear cycle forms and we learn withdrawal. But we only learn withdrawal to limit our awareness of our deeper emotional turmoil. This brings us directly now to the mind-body syndrome, or TMS, a concept first recognized in the 1970s by John Sarno, a rehabilitation physician at New York University. What Sarno observed is that when repressed emotions threaten to surface into the conscious mind, the brain generates physical and psychological preoccupations to distract us from them. When the brain learns these distractions, this is what we could call the mind-body syndrome. And learned withdrawal is a form of TMS. What this means is that the purpose of learning withdrawal is to prevent us from knowing what's going on up here by keeping our focus everywhere else, especially on scary or disturbing sensations. Now, this doesn't mean we can't feel powerful emotions, but the brain is doing its best to protect us, especially from the most threatening emotions relevant to your situation. Now, the obvious problem here is that the brain has almost certainly overreacted to our emotions, and its strategy is now backfiring. It's too much. I mean, protracted withdrawal can be so destructive to our lives. Fortunately, it's possible to intervene in this process and unlearn withdrawal. This involves letting go of the idea of protracted withdrawal syndrome as a physical disorder and acknowledging its emotional basis. And we'll go into that in chapter 4. But first, I want to share some of my own experiences of withdrawal as an illustration of TMS and hopefully clarify this concept. Margot never found out about TMS, so we'll say goodbye now as I begin talking about my own story. Some time ago, I had an adverse reaction to Paxil. I took it one afternoon after not taking it for years and woke up later that night feeling unbearably sick. By morning, at first, I was beginning to feel better, but waves of this sickness would mysteriously return and worsen for months. Now, another thing about these waves is that they seem to originate from my stomach. It hurt almost constantly. I thought I must have some serious stomach illness. On top of that, and this is weird, I sometimes felt this strange sensation that I was going to hell, like actually descending there. Obviously, I was very concerned about this and repeatedly sought medical explanations for what was happening to me. But doctors couldn't explain it. So they eventually gave up and placed me in a psychiatric ward. While I was there, I learned the results of a laboratory test I'd been waiting on. And as it turned out, my stomach was perfectly healthy. After learning this, I could no longer buy into the idea that something was wrong with me. So the next time I felt a wave coming on, I reminded myself that I was healthy. And you know what happened? That wave, i.e. this protracted reaction to Paxil, it immediately stopped. Like that. After months of terrifying waves, they just disappeared. Now, what's truly going on with me in this story? How could this protracted drug reaction stop from only a shift in my perspective? At the time, I had no idea, and psychiatrists weren't even interested. They just explained away my experiences with meaningless psychiatric labels and drugged me into oblivion. If only these so-called medical professionals had received a mind-body education instead of a psychiatric one, important questions could have been considered. For instance, when I had this drug reaction, did it occur around a period of psychological stress? Well, yes, it did. I had just gone through a difficult time in my life, so my brain was already on high alert. Then when I had the reaction to Paxil, I was so overwhelmed with fear that it triggered repressed emotions from earlier in my life. My fleeting sensations about going to hell didn't come from nowhere. They came from a past of religious abuse. And when my unresolved emotions about this were turning on, they started manifesting in odd ways. But once my brain recognized that my surfacing religious trauma was too much for me to bear, my brain sought to protect me by redirecting my attention toward the adverse reaction, especially my stomach. My hell anxiety then faded as I became fixated on my health. What happened next is my fear and preoccupation with my body reinforced the neural pathways processing the adverse reaction. And so even when the actual reaction passed, my brain learned to reproduce its sensations on its own. In other words, I got trapped in a fear cycle that fueled these sensations to persist. What got me out of this was when I realized that my fear about my stomach was a false alarm. My stomach, after all, was healthy. My perspective then shifted toward feeling safe. This broke the fear cycle around my health, and the sensations went away. I unlearned them. This suggests that what I was experiencing wasn't a protracted drug reaction, but mind-body syndrome. But unfortunately, this was not the end of my mind-body problems, because I remained oblivious to the deeper cause of why I learned this adverse reaction. What I mean is that while I learned this reaction through my fear and preoccupation with it, I hadn't acknowledged the deeper emotional processing as the ultimate source of my fear. I'm talking now about my unconscious emotions related to my childhood religious trauma and other oppressive events in my life that remained mostly outside my conscious awareness. So yes, while I lost the superficial fear about my body, my deeper fear and my deeper emotions remained unaddressed. This meant I remained vulnerable to TMS or more TMS. And that's what Sarno calls the symptom imperative. This means that when we lose our fear of one TMS sensation, another one eventually will pop up in its place. This could happen over and over again until we finally acknowledge the emotional basis of these sensations. For myself then, the worst of these was still to come, years later in fact, not long after I stopped taking psychiatric drugs. Before I get directly into my withdrawal experience, I'd like to provide some personal background information to make for a better illustration of how TMS develops. Specifically, I'd like to share a traumatic experience from my childhood, one I've already hinted at. I see the following experience as contributing to my own unconscious emotions that increased my vulnerability to learning withdrawal. I don't want to reduce everything to one event, but for the sake of simplicity, this will be my example. It happened while I was visiting a Christian camp. There, I watched a Christian propaganda movie about the apocalypse, or rapture, a prophesied end-of-the-world event where Christ ascends his believers from earth to heaven. The people left behind, prospectively me, are left in the hands of the Antichrist, who tortures us and sends us to hell. Instantly, I suffered existential dread about the future of my soul and a deep fear of abandonment that my family could be raptured without me. Partly as a result of this unsettling experience, I spent much of my adolescence in at least a partial state of hypervigilance. Will the rapture happen today? I wondered. My alarm bells would go off more easily. My personality became more perfectionistic and self-critical. I think an unconscious effort to be good and hopefully avoid God's judgment. But all this existential fear and internal pressure created emotions within me that, as an adolescent, I was ill-equipped to handle. So my unconscious mind acted to protect me by shifting my attention from this psychological threat to something else, anything else. And that turned out to be my body. So I started getting allergies, rashes, unexplained pain, nervousness, sadness, so on. This marked the beginning of my own mind-body phenomena. As I became an adult, I basically pushed these religious fears aside. But the traumatized child remained within me as a reservoir of repressed emotions threatening to overflow. They just needed one good push. My adverse reaction to Paxil, along with my stress at that time, was just that. This set off a danger signal that reminded my brain of frightening buried emotions from my childhood. And I went right back there. That's why I had those sensations of going to hell. Sadly, when I saw psychiatrists about this, they didn't care what happened to me. They just wanted to say what was wrong with me. As a result, I was dehumanized into a psychiatric patient. And as years went by, I became increasingly disabled by psychiatric drugs. When I finally raised concerns about the drugs to psychiatrists, they just responded by lining me up for electroshock. At this point, my alarm bells started going off even more, and it was a familiar alarm. It was not the first time I felt unsafe within an authoritarian institution. The first was the church, only this time I wasn't trying to escape Christian hell, but the psychiatric one. So I decided to get out and stop taking psychiatric drugs. But I did so much too quickly. Acute withdrawal suddenly came, then faded, but never fully went away. I was left with disturbing sensations that slowly increased for about 5 months, until they just exploded. I think this delay paralleled my slow realization of the extent of my rage towards psychiatry and other oppressive situations in my life. This necessitated more and worse withdrawal sensations to distract me from the profound hurt and sadness I was beginning to feel inside. It reached the point where I actually reinstated some psychiatric drugs and then began tapering off them very slowly. This did help somewhat, but withdrawal sensations would continue, and they could get very scary. Now, how on earth did I ever get out of this situation? That is, how did I realize withdrawal is TMS? Well, back when withdrawal sensations were slowly building, I suffered a back injury. The injury quickly healed, but the pain didn't go away. Chronic pain eventually spread around my entire body and debilitated me to the point where I was partially bedridden for 5 years. What made my situation feel particularly hopeless, and I was utterly hopeless, is that I appeared to have 2 incurable problems. One was protracted withdrawal, and the other chronic pain. Here's a brief list of some of the things I experienced. Now, one of the confusing things here is that withdrawal sensations overlapped with pain sensations. In other words, I often couldn't tell which was which. This is me doing physio exercises, by the way. They didn't work. It was medically unexplainable. To make a long story short, I made a last-ditch effort to resolve the pain by reading John Sarno. Although Sarno originally struck me as a quack despite never reading him, when I listened to Healing Back Pain, I identified with the TMS concept. I then applied his mind-body approach to pain, and it worked. 5 years of debilitating pain just gone. But that's not all that happened. To my surprise, protracted withdrawal sensations also went away at the exact same time. Now, how could this be? How could both protracted withdrawal and chronic pain begin and end at the exact same time? Well, as I've been suggesting here, it's because, like chronic pain, protracted withdrawal is a learned neuroplastic phenomenon. In other words, it's mind-body syndrome. What this means is that the way to resolve TMS is essentially the same, no matter what form the mind-body sensations take. Now, to be clear, when I realized that withdrawal sensations were also going away, I used TMS techniques on them directly to finish them off, and later to prevent them from returning. But how exactly do we apply a TMS approach to resolve withdrawal experiences? Let's turn our attention to that now. Finally, we've arrived at the action-oriented chapter, where I get to the point, just how do we solve this darn thing? Well, what's unique about the TMS approach is that it's all about learning. That's how protracted withdrawal began, and that's how it ends. In fact, John Sarno describes this learning-based approach as knowledge therapy. Up to this point, I've shared TMS knowledge with you, and specifically how it relates to protracted or learned withdrawal. But now I'd like to share how to make this knowledge therapeutic. And what we'll see here is what's key to the TMS approach is making this knowledge personal, making the mind-body connection for yourself. We'll now look at several ways to accomplish this and why we can unlearn withdrawal through our understanding alone. Let's begin at what's really the first step, and that's asking yourself, could you consider that what you're now experiencing is TMS? That is, you're no longer in withdrawal, but you've learned its sensations to distract yourself from deeper emotional suffering. It can be difficult, I know, to let go of the idea of protracted withdrawal syndrome, but the way learned sensations behave, how they come and go, change forms, worsen with stress, that's generally inconsistent with any explainable physical disorder. And it's important to eventually accept that nothing is wrong with your nervous system. Because knowing this helps calm the brain's danger signal. And again, it's this sense of danger we feel that's prolonging the sensations. Personally, once I saw myself as possibly healthy, that's when I could move forward with the TMS approach. When I used to feel withdrawal sensations, I'd often get very fearful and think withdrawal would never go away and that my life was ruined. I really didn't know how else to respond. For a TMS approach, however, I learned it's important to change my relationship to these sensations I felt. Specifically, I needed to reframe withdrawal sensations, not as a symptom, but as a sign of my unconscious emotions calling out for my attention. So, in recognition of this, if I started getting sucked in to withdrawal sensations, I'd remind myself about the psychology of TMS. I'd tell myself that I know there are things I'm upset about that have generated very powerful emotions, and protracted withdrawal sensations only developed to distract me from them. This sort of psychological thinking is actually a starting point for making our own mind-body connection. And here's how. As you now know, the purpose of TMS is to preoccupy us from becoming fully aware of our painful emotions. So, following this logic, when we consciously shift our attention away from withdrawal sensations and ask ourselves what we might be feeling or what's going on in our lives, we begin to disrupt the purpose of TMS. When we do this repeatedly and remind ourselves we're safe and healthy, the brain learns that its distraction is beginning not to work. Over time, this contributes to unlearning withdrawal by disrupting withdrawal pathways that feed on your fear and attention. Now, you might interject here and say you're already thinking psychologically about your life. Of course, when I thought I was in withdrawal, I repeatedly replayed upsetting memories in my mind. But for myself, I was really only dwelling on the past. I wasn't making the mind-body connection between my emotions and withdrawal. And it's this sort of psychological thinking that's necessary. Although it's not exactly easy to do, right? It requires willpower. Plus, withdrawal sensations can be so overwhelming, they encompass our entire attention. So to help us make this shift in our awareness, we also may need to work on a deeper level as well. Both learning and unlearning withdrawal takes place in the unconscious mind. That is, the unconscious areas of the brain. In this sense, when we learn withdrawal, we're basically passengers. Withdrawal sensations turn on to autopilot, and we develop an ingrained belief we're in withdrawal, or that something's wrong with us. To unlearn withdrawal, however, we now need to take the driver's role and persuade the unconscious mind we know we're experiencing an emotional process and not a physical disorder. This is so important because when we persuade the unconscious mind, our perspective genuinely shifts. As a result, we'll automatically know we're not in withdrawal anymore, and withdrawal sensations will lose their power to distract us. Now, this shift in perspective does take some effort. So let's look at a few ways to engage this deeper form of learning. My first suggestion is simply to continue learning about TMS. Find your favorite materials and then read or listen to them repeatedly. Now, I say repeatedly because repetition is particularly important for a TMS approach. The unconscious mind can be slow and resistant to change, so a steady influx of TMS knowledge helps facilitate the learning process. For myself, I absorbed Sarno and other TMS materials several times a day. This reminded me, or at least the unconscious me, that I was safe and healthy, even though I didn't always feel that way. Now, another technique that engages the unconscious mind is expressive journaling. There are many TMS materials that discuss this in greater detail, but for now, I'll say this. Expressive journaling is when you focus your mind on a specific topic or no topic and write what instinctively comes to you. Similarly, you could pen letters to people that you don't send, or even write imaginary dialogues. The point here is to acknowledge roots of rage, sadness, and other powerful emotions your mind might be distracting you from, and then reminding yourself that you're now safe. You do not, I repeat, you do not have to dwell over the past or discover the unconscious emotions or events that caused TMS. Also, to be clear, you don't have to feel all these powerful emotions for this to work. You just have to accept that they're there. That in itself can reduce hidden emotional tension. Now, I just caution here that if there are things from your past you know are too painful to revisit, or if you find yourself emotionally overwhelmed, then either pace yourself or don't do this. Find something else within the TMS approach that works better for you. For example, you could simply confront your unconscious mind directly, either in your head or out loud. Hey, unconscious mind, stop trying to trick me into still thinking I'm in withdrawal, because I know I'm not. I know what's really going on is I have all these powerful emotions inside. I know I'm upset about psychiatry and religion and probably other things I don't even know about or can remember. But you know what? It's safe to have emotions. And I am now safe. So you don't have to try to distract me with these withdrawal sensations, because I'm safe. I don't need all of this, so just stop it. Alternatively, instead of asking the mind to stop, you could practice acceptance. Hey, unconscious mind. Yeah, it's me again. Listen, I'm just going to accept these sensations that I'm feeling. And I'm not going to put up any resistance, because I know these sensations are basically just unfelt emotions. So I'm just going to carry on with the mind-body work in the knowledge that I'm safe and healthy, because I know I'm going to be okay. In fact, I already am okay. I just haven't totally convinced you of that yet. Now, you may wish to limit the time you spend on these activities, because a TMS approach is not really about doing. It's all about understanding. Plus, there's something else I imagine that's our ultimate aspiration. Returning to your life, embracing positive sensations again, connecting with people. This can be tough when you're still dealing with withdrawal sensations. For myself, one thing holding me back was a sort of victimhood, that I'm doomed to withdrawal forever, and if I try to do something enjoyable, that's when withdrawal will get me the worst. See, back in my fear-based days, I was reading horror stories about withdrawal, commiserating online, and generally cultivating an attitude of helplessness. But I had to stop scaring myself. So I stopped counting good days and bad days, I stopped talking about withdrawal, and I even requested others stop asking me about it. In short, I stopped trying to heal. I was healed. I just didn't know it yet. Now, if you're still taking psychiatric drugs, or tapering, or something urgent comes up, then yes, monitoring withdrawal sensations might be important. The point here is that I had to break from activities that promoted fear and distracted me from living my life. When I sought purpose beyond withdrawal, this contributed to me feeling better because I was shifting my awareness toward the present. Presence in the here and now can be so helpful in overcoming fear-based thinking. Honestly, though, I still find this challenging. Any person who's experienced TMS is inclined to live in their head. But moving toward our joy and doing things that bring out our inherent joy helps to move this process along. Now, if all of what I've said so far sounds overwhelming, then please remember that you're not alone. This is tmswiki.org, a wiki and forum for people experiencing TMS to gather knowledge, exchange stories, and support each other. You can also find a directory here of TMS physicians and consultants, some of whom also support people in resolving withdrawal sensations. One such consultant is Steve Ozanich. His work, The Great Pain Deception, is a classic in the TMS field, and after Sarno, the work I recommend most. TMS physician and internist Howard Schubiner also helps people work through withdrawal sensations, and there are more as well. I would note, though, that TMS Wiki is not necessarily free from psychiatric perspectives, so please keep this in mind if you're using this site. Finally, I'll conclude this chapter by saying that everyone resolves TMS differently and in their own time. Suffice to say, when it comes to the TMS approach, you unlearn withdrawal once you make your own mind-body connection and fully accept the emotional basis of withdrawal sensations. This happens as your understanding deepens and your perspective shifts. And then you actually stop caring about sensations. You start laughing or rolling your eyes at them as if to say, really? You still think you can trick me with this? Again, this takes some time, but as your way of thinking changes, you'll become less preoccupied. You'll lose your fear. This means you'll no longer feed withdrawal neural pathways, and the brain will realize its distraction no longer works. And so it just gives up the illusion. In other words, you'll have pulled back the curtain on withdrawal sensations to reveal your emotional self. And if we accept ourselves as fundamentally emotional beings, then the purpose of withdrawal is defeated. Now, before we move on, I'll make one final note. When you start using a TMS approach, you may notice an increase in sensations, or that they change and move around more. That can happen. The brain may initially fight back or try to scare you with new stuff, especially if you start questioning the validity of the old stuff or old sensations. Just address them the same way I suggested here, and they should likewise go away. All right, we'll now head to our last and shortest chapter, where I'll address potential barriers to the TMS approach. The first potential barrier to talk about here is the possible misunderstanding of the psychology of TMS. In our situation, for instance, it might sound like withdrawal is all in your head, or that you have an emotional problem, or that psychiatric drugs haven't negatively affected you. To be clear, none of that is true. Withdrawal reactions to psychiatric drugs are, of course, real. Now, the idea that our unconscious emotions drive our learning of withdrawal might sound like the blame shifts from the drug to you. Again, though, this is not the case. Our emotions and the pressures we placed on ourselves developed unconsciously and in response to oppressive circumstances in our lives. If we lived in a better world, perhaps none of this would have happened. That said, from where we sit today, it's now up to us to determine our paths from here. The first book written on TMS is Mind Over Back Pain by John Sarno. As its title suggests, TMS was originally developed for chronic pain. However, Sarno's later books expanded upon this to include what he calls TMS equivalents. It's still TMS, just in a different form than pain. Protracted withdrawal is technically a TMS equivalent. However, it has the same psychological basis as TMS, and its solution is essentially the same. I'll also note here that Sarno's physical explanations of TMS differ from what I've talked about in this video. But again, it's the psychology that matters. Finally, so you know, Sarno does not discuss drug withdrawal in his books, but they remain invaluable resources if we just substitute chronic pain for learned withdrawal. In fact, his book, Healing Back Pain, could really be called Healing Withdrawal Sensations. I saw myself all throughout that book, as people often do. To begin looking at the efficacy of the TMS approach, let's first highlight its success for its original purpose. That is neuroplastic back pain. Now, the conventional perspective on back pain and other neuroplastic syndromes is that no medical intervention exists to resolve them. However, as I mentioned way back in the first chapter, 2 clinical trials were recently published on Sarno-inspired approaches, and there participants essentially resolved the pain for themselves. On top of these clinical trials are informal studies done by Sarno himself and an ABC News investigation where almost everyone reported being pain-free. Reviews of Sarno's books and success stories from TMS Wiki broaden the evidence base as people report resolutions from far beyond chronic pain. So I think we can say that Sarno's mind-body approach clearly can work for TMS. But what about protracted withdrawal specifically? Well, this comes down to anecdotal accounts. Personally, the fact I resolved 5 years of withdrawal-like experiences using this method myself makes this easy for me to know. But I'm not the only one reporting success. I've personally communicated with others who've resolved withdrawal this same way. And as I've mentioned, I know of a few TMS practitioners and consultants who've helped many people in our situation as well. Now, if all this is true, then where are all the TMS success stories for withdrawal? Well, as I mentioned before, TMS was originally meant for people in chronic pain, and those success stories do abound. Yet, even for most people in pain, this approach is too obscure for them to find. Sarno's ideas are almost completely ignored by the medical community. It took like 50 years just to get clinical trials, and though successful, these trials will likely also be ignored. One reason for that is that people healing themselves is not in the financial interests of the medical and pharmaceutical industries that rely on blaming a broken brain or body. Also, there's a scientific bias that devalues the role of emotions in human health. However, it's emotions that are at the core of being human, and they're demonstrably involved in several neuroplastic syndromes. This scientific bias, however, is so strong that even people who hear about TMS will likely reject it just on those grounds alone. I mean, I did so for years. But then I made my own personal mind-body connection, and my views completely changed. And now I can't help but wonder, had I not learned about TMS through my own experiences with chronic pain, would I still be dealing with protracted withdrawal sensations today? All right, I'll conclude in a moment with an overall summary and 1 or 2 final thoughts. In summation, let's review what we've gone over in this video, a mind-body approach to protracted withdrawal syndrome. In Chapter 1, we asked, what is protracted withdrawal syndrome? The answer I proposed is that protracted withdrawal is really a misnomer, because we're not actually in withdrawal anymore. We've just learned its sensations. I further propose that the way we learn withdrawal, at least on the surface, is through a cycle of fear and preoccupation with the withdrawal experience itself. This results in the repeated firing of the neural pathways generating our withdrawal experience until the brain learns to reproduce these sensations on its own. In Chapter 2, we asked, what is the mind-body syndrome? Here we looked at why we learn withdrawal and saw that the source of our fear and preoccupation is deeper, unconscious emotional processing perceived by the brain as dangerous. This processing involves threatening repressed emotions from childhood pressures, internal pressures, and adult pressures that have now turned on due to overwhelming psychological stress, including from the acute withdrawal reaction. This means these emotions are now active in the brain and threatening to enter our conscious awareness. As a result, the mind-body syndrome develops to direct our attention away from our emotional turmoil and onto the withdrawal reaction itself. We can then get so preoccupied with withdrawal sensations that we learn them through a fear cycle, as shown in Chapter 1. Moving on to Chapter 3 now, there I shared a few of my own personal experiences, including a protracted withdrawal experience, as an illustration of TMS. I noted that when I thought I had withdrawal, I also developed chronic pain after an injury. When I applied a mind-body approach to the chronic pain, however, not only did the pain go away, but withdrawal sensations faded at the exact same time. That was the beginning of my understanding that protracted withdrawal is just another form of TMS. This takes us to Chapter 4, where we looked at what a TMS approach to protracted withdrawal actually looks like. And what we saw is that this approach is all about making the mind-body connection for ourselves. To do this, we must reject the idea of protracted withdrawal as a physical disorder and re-educate ourselves about the emotional basis of withdrawal sensations. Withdrawal pathways will then deactivate once we experience a shift in our perspective and we fully understand we're not in withdrawal anymore. Finally, in Chapter 5, we addressed potential barriers to a TMS approach. And since we just went over that, I'll point out something related here, and that's this. All humans have emotions, so everyone at some point experiences mind-body syndrome. So again, this is not a disease. No one has TMS. It's not independent of us. It's not TMS and I. Our mind-body experiences are simply part of the human condition. TMS is just a term used to identify this aspect of it. Now, maybe our mind-body experiences are more painful than others, but that's only because our life experiences might likewise have been more painful. And it's our bodies that are a reflection of our innermost selves. What this means is that something inside us is crying out for attention, for compassion and soothing and kindness. We may need to learn to love ourselves again and perhaps to forgive. Now, whether this mind-body approach is right for yourself at this time That's, of course, entirely up to you. If you do wish to know more, you can click on the resource link in the description below this video. Thank you for allowing me to share my story with you, and I hope you join me on the other side of withdrawal. Although I would suggest that you're already there. You just don't know it yet.